June 1944. The air over Normandy was a thick metallic soup, a churning broth of cordite, churned earth, and the sweet, cloying scent of fear. For the men of the 21st Panzer Division, the world had shrunk to the grey, shaking interior of their transport vehicles and the sliver of scarred landscape visible through the viewing ports. They were lions in a cage of their own making, forged in the crucible of an ideology that promised them 1,000-year dominion. Their minds were fortresses, built from the granite of propaganda, mortared with the grim pride of battlefield successes in Poland, in France, in the vast, frozen steppes of Russia. They saw themselves as the inheritors of a warrior tradition, a people of singular will and destiny, pitted against a world of lesser races and crumbling empires. Their enemies were caricatures fed to them in grainy newsreels and strident radio broadcasts. The Russians were subhuman hordes driven by commissars and vodka. The British were a doddering aristocracy, their time long past. And the Americans were the ultimate joke. They were, as the Reichspropaganda minister assured them, a mongrel nation, a chaotic jazz-fueled rabble of cowboys and gangsters, soft and decadent, their strength a fragile illusion built on Hollywood tinsel and Jewish finance. Their soldiers were believed to be poorly trained, lacking the fighting spirit, the Elan, that defined the German Lanza. Every German soldier carried this certainty in his rucksack, a piece of essential equipment alongside his rifle and field rations. They expected to meet an enemy that would break easily, an army whose supply lines were stretched to the breaking point, a nation whose industrial might was a bluff, a paper tiger that would surely fold under the first, truly determined assault. The sight of Allied material superiority in Normandy was unsettling, a dissonant note in their triumphant symphony, but it was easily explained away. A temporary surge, a logistical fluke. The decadent Americans were throwing everything they had into this one desperate gamble. Once it failed, their entire fragile system would collapse. They held on to this belief with the grim tenacity of a drowning man clinging to a splinter of wood. The men huddled in their half-track remembered the stories from the Eastern Front of entire Russian divisions surrendering out of sheer hopelessness. They expected a similar, if less dramatic, collapse here. They anticipated that capturing American soldiers would be like capturing disillusioned children, soft boys torn from their drugstores and movie palaces, who would weep for their mothers and bemoan their fate. They envisioned an America crippled by the war effort, its people starving and riotous, its infrastructure groaning under the strain. This was not just a belief, it was an article of faith, a core tenet of their worldview. The world was meant to be conquered by the strong, the pure, the determined. And they, the soldiers of the Third Reich, were the very definition of that strength. The alternative was simply unthinkable, a logical impossibility. But as the world outside their steel shell dissolved into a maelstrom of fire and thunder on the beaches, the first cracks in that fortress of certainty began to appear, tiny fissures that would soon splinter into chasms. If you find this perspective on history fascinating, subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the untold stories of the past. The transition from soldier to prisoner was a violent severance. One moment they were masters of a roaring steel beast. The next, they were debris washed up on the shore of a lost war, stripped of weapons, of rank, of identity itself. Herded into makeshift enclosures on the coast of France, the initial shock of defeat gave way to a sullen, gnawing dread. The journey to the United States was a descent into the unknown, a passage into the belly of the beast they had been taught to despise. The transport ship that carried them across the Atlantic was the first true anomaly. It was not a repurposed luxury liner or a grim prison hulk. It was a liberty ship, one of hundreds, perhaps thousands, stamped out of a mold with an efficiency that was both crude and terrifying. The welds were rough, the design Spartan, but it was immense, and it ploughed through the waves with an unyielding purpose. The food they were given was another shock. It was not the thin, watery soup they had expected, but white bread, thick slices of processed meat, and coffee, real coffee, hot and sweet. The men ate it with suspicion, whispering among themselves. It was a trick, a performance for the Red Cross, a fleeting moment of generosity before the true nature of their captors revealed itself. Their arrival in America did little to dispel this cynicism. Disembarking at a port in Virginia, they were met not with jeering crowds or cruel guards, but with a kind of bored, bureaucratic competence that was somehow more unnerving. They were processed, deloused, and issued new clothing with an assembly line speed that felt inhuman. Then came the trains. The windows were blacked out at first, a precaution against escape or espionage, and the men sat in the dim, swaying cars, their world reduced to the rhythmic clatter of wheels on steel and the murmur of anxious German voices. They were travelling deep into enemy territory, a land they had been told was a fragile facade. They expected to see evidence of this fragility, of the strain of a nation at war. They were prepared for shuttered factories, overgrown fields, and impoverished towns. The reality, when the blackout screens were finally removed, was a profound and jarring violation of their deepest held convictions. The train was rolling through the heart of Pennsylvania, and the first thing they saw was not decay, but construction. A new highway was being carved out of the rolling hills alongside the tracks, but it was the method of this construction that froze them in their seats. There were no columns of weary labourers with picks and shovels. Instead, there was a procession of monstrous yellow machines, each one performing a task with terrifying force and precision. A machine with a giant maw chewed up the earth and spat it into a line of waiting trucks. Another laid a bed of crushed rock with perfect uniformity, and behind it, a final, colossal machine extruded a wide, smooth ribbon of black asphalt steaming in the afternoon sun. A handful of men, looking almost casual as they leaned on levers and steered wheels, were accomplishing in an hour what would have taken a battalion of German pioneers a week. The prisoners stared, their faces a mixture of disbelief and a dawning, unsettling awe. The hardened sergeant, a veteran of Stalingrad, simply shook his head, a wry, bitter smile touching his lips. "Propaganda," he muttered to the man next to him. "They must have known we were coming." A show for the prisoners. But the show, they were beginning to suspect, had no end. Don't miss our next episode on the psychological warfare of World War II. Hit the notification bell to stay updated. The train journey became a relentless assault on their senses and their sanity. For days, the panorama of American power scrolled past their windows, a silent, damning testament to the lies they had been fed. The scale of it was impossible to comprehend. They passed through the industrial heartland, a landscape of towering smokestacks that painted the sky with a constant, hazy banner of productivity. At night, the horizon glowed with the fires of foundries and steel mills, entire cities of light and industry that never slept. They saw factories that seemed to stretch for miles, their parking lots filled with thousands of cars belonging to the workers, not the clunky, state-issued vehicles of Germany, but sleek, personal automobiles, symbol of unimaginable wealth and individual freedom. The prisoners fell into a stunned silence, the usual barracks room banter replaced by long periods of staring, of quiet, personal reckoning. The sheer, unadulterated might of it all was a physical weight pressing down on their chests, making it difficult to breathe. Their cynical explanations began to crumble one by one. The highway construction could be a show, but could these endless factories also be a show? Could the miles-long freight trains that thundered past them in the opposite direction laden with a cornucopia of war materiel, tanks, jeeps, cannons, crates of ammunition, all so numerous they defied counting, also be part of the elaborate deception. The trains were a particularly potent symbol. In Germany, every locomotive, every piece of rolling stock was a precious national asset, meticulously allocated and jealously guarded. Here they seemed to be an infinite resource. The prisoners would count the cars, 50, 100, sometimes 200 or more, pulled by massive diesel-electric engines that radiated an aura of untroubled power. The sheer volume of material moving across the country, seemingly without effort, suggested a logistical capacity that was not just superior to Germany's, but operated on an entirely different plane of existence. The war effort that was bleeding the Reich dry, demanding total mobilization and immense sacrifice from its populace, appeared here to be just one function of a system so vast and productive that it could sustain this conflict without breaking a sweat. The agricultural landscape was just as shocking. They had been taught that the American farmer was a dispossessed pauper, a victim of capitalist exploitation. What they saw were not peasants toiling with horse-drawn plows, but vast geometric fields of corn and wheat that stretched to the horizon, cultivated by roaring green and red tractors that moved with the tireless energy of the new age. They saw farmhouses with electricity and telephones, barns bigger than their village churches. They saw a land not of scarcity and struggle, but of obscene, effortless abundance. The young ideologue, a boy of 19 who had joined the Hitler Youth with fervent passion, found his faith beginning to curdle into a bitter acid in his stomach. Everything he saw was a contradiction, a heresy against the established truths of his world. This was not a nation on the verge of collapse. This was a nation that was just getting started. He began to wonder, in the dark, swaying confines of the train car, what else they had been wrong about. If you appreciate stories that challenge conventional narratives, consider supporting our work on Patreon. The link is in the description below. The final destination was a POW camp in rural Alabama, a place of red clay, soaring pines, and a humidity so thick it felt like a wet blanket. The camp itself was another source of cognitive dissonance. It was not a grim barbed wire hellhole run by sadistic guards. The barracks were simple wooden structures, but they were clean, dry, and surprisingly spacious. The food, while monotonous, was plentiful. The guards were a mix of older men and soldiers deemed unfit for combat duty, and they treated the prisoners with a strange, almost baffling lack of malice. There was no screaming, no beatings, no overt cruelty. There was only a set of rules and a system of administration. This professional, dispassionate approach was more psychologically disarming than outright brutality. They were prepared to endure hatred. They were not prepared to be managed like a piece of inventory in a vast continental warehouse. The work assigned to them was the most potent education of all. Some were sent to local farms to help with the harvest, where they came face to face with the mechanical wonders they had only glimpsed from the train. They learned to operate machinery that did the work of 20 men, their hands accustomed to the rifle and the spade, now guiding the immense power of an internal combustion engine. Others were put to work on projects within the camp itself, expanding its facilities to accommodate the ever-growing stream of prisoners from the collapsing European front. It was here that the true nature of American power revealed itself not as a grand spectacle, but as a daily, methodical, and inescapable reality. One week, the camp commandant announced the construction of a new hospital wing. The German prisoners, many of whom had experience in construction, estimated it would take months of hard labor. The very next day, a convoy of flatbed trucks arrived. They were not carrying lumber, bricks, and bags of cement. They were carrying entire walls, prefabricated sections complete with window frames and insulation, built in a factory hundreds of miles away. A crane, a machine that most of the prisoners had only ever seen in major German cities, was assembled in a matter of hours. Then the ballet began. Under the direction of a handful of civilian contractors, the crane operator began lifting the massive wall sections from the trucks and lowering them into place. The sections fit together with perfect precision. A team of workers swarmed over the structure, bolting them together, running electrical wiring that was already threaded through the panels and connecting pre-assembled plumbing fixtures. The German prisoners were tasked with ancillary duties, digging drainage ditches, clearing debris, and they worked in a stunned daze, their own manual labor feeling primitive and absurd in the shadow of this hyper-efficient process. What they had thought would take months was framed, walled, and roofed in less than 2 weeks. The technician, a former engineering student from Stuttgart, watched the process with a mixture of professional fascination and existential despair. He saw the genius of it, the standardization, the modular design, the seamless integration of logistics and labor. He also saw the utter hopelessness of Germany's position. They were fighting a war of craftsmanship against a war of mass production. They were a nation of skilled artisans attempting to fend off a tidal wave from a continent-sized factory. Each perfectly fitted joint, each efficiently installed window was another nail in the coffin of the Third Reich. He felt a profound sense of humiliation, not as a soldier defeated in battle, but as a man whose entire conception of progress and modernity had been rendered obsolete. He realized they weren't just prisoners of war, they were artifacts in a museum of a bygone era. Enjoying this historical narrative? Let us know in the comments what other hidden histories you'd like us to explore. The daily encounters with American abundance chipped away at their ideological armor, exposing the vulnerable men beneath. It wasn't just the grand displays of industrial might, it was the small, casual, everyday things. It was the camp guards who would toss a half-eaten chocolate bar into a trash can, an act of wastefulness so profound it made the prisoners, who had subsisted on ersatz coffee and black bread for years, physically sick with a mixture of hunger and rage. It was the sheer variety of food available in the camp's modest PX, where prisoners with a small work stipend could buy cigarettes, candy, and Coca-Cola, products of a consumer economy that seemed to be functioning without any wartime restrictions. A bottle of Coca-Cola became a symbol more potent than a flag. For the Americans, it was a trivial refreshment. For the Germans, it was a dark, sweet, carbonated distillation of a world they could not comprehend, a world of surplus, of pleasure, of a power so immense it could afford to be frivolous, even in the midst of a global conflict. The prisoners began to compare this reality with the world they had left behind. They remembered the grim rationing, the constant calls for sacrifice, the ersatz everything. They remembered the worn-out equipment, the desperate need for fuel and spare parts, the logistics of their own army, which often felt like a series of improvisations and miracles. They had been told that these sacrifices were a sign of their strength, their willingness to endure what the soft democracies could not. They were a testament to their superior will. But now that narrative was inverted. They saw that the Americans didn't need the same level of sacrifice because their system produced so much that sacrifice was largely unnecessary for the vast majority. Their strength was not in their will, but in their seemingly infinite material capacity. This realization was a slow-acting poison. It induced a profound sense of futility. What was the point of their years of fighting, of the frozen hell of the Eastern Front, of the deaths of their comrades, if the enemy they were fighting was not even playing the same game? This new understanding began to reshape their perception of their captors. The American guards were no longer seen as decadent weaklings. Their casual, easygoing nature was reinterpreted. It was not a sign of poor discipline, but of a deep, unstated confidence. They didn't need to be fanatical ideologues because they were backed by a system that was undeniably, overwhelmingly superior. They were cogs in a machine that worked, and they knew it. A quiet, grudging respect began to grow among the prisoners, an emotion they found deeply shameful. They were forced to admire the very enemy they were sworn to destroy. The sergeant saw it in the way the camp was organized, the way supplies arrived on time, every time. The technicians saw it in every machine, every piece of standardized equipment. The believer felt it as a cold void opening within him, as the fervent slogans of his youth turned to ash in his mouth. He looked at the guards, chewing their gum and reading their comic books, and for the first time he didn't see an inferior race. He saw the victors, and he saw them not as supermen, but as ordinary men who were simply and damningly on the right side of history's great industrial equation. If this story resonates with you, please share it with someone who appreciates history as much as you do. The psychological transformation was not a sudden epiphany, but a slow erosion, like a river carving a canyon through stone. The men spent their days working and their nights in the barracks, the familiar German dialects filling the air. But the conversations had changed. There was less talk of past battlefield glories and more hushed, anxious speculation about the future. They argued and debated, trying to reconcile the America they saw with the one they had been taught to believe in. Some clung desperately to the old propaganda, insisting that this was all a facade, that the real America was starving and riotous just beyond the horizon. But their arguments grew weaker with each passing day, with each new, undeniable piece of evidence. The arrival of new prisoners, captured in the final desperate battles of the war, only confirmed the grim reality. They brought stories of an Allied war machine that had become an unstoppable juggernaut, a river of steel that had swept away the last vestiges of the Wehrmacht. The prisoners began to observe their captors with an almost anthropological fascination. They noted the casual way Americans from different parts of the country, a boy from Brooklyn, a farmer from Iowa, a Texan oil worker, interacted, their regional differences a source of banter, not division. This stood in stark contrast to the rigid, hierarchical, and often brutal social structures of their own military. They saw a society that, for all its perceived chaos, was held together by an invisible framework of shared assumptions and incredible wealth. The guards would talk about their post-war plans, buying a car, starting a business, going to college on the GI Bill. Their futures were canvases of infinite possibility. The German prisoners, in contrast, had no future to speak of. Their nation was in ruins, their ideology was a proven failure, and their own survival was uncertain. A deep, corrosive envy began to take root, an emotion far more destructive than simple hatred. The comparison became a constant, internal torment. Every well-paved road in America was a rebuke to the potholed, bomb-cratered highways of Germany. Every brightly lit town was a ghost haunting the blacked-out, rubble-strewn cities they had left behind. Every roaring tractor was a symbol of an agricultural bounty that made the Reich's desperate quest for Lebensraum seem not only criminal, but pathetic. They had been told they were a master race destined to rule a world of inferiors. But here, in the heart of their enemy's homeland, they felt like primitives who had stumbled into a civilization so advanced it operated on principles they could barely grasp. The shock was not merely industrial or economic, it was existential. If everything they had been told about their enemies was a lie, what did that say about the cause for which they had fought and bled? Their entire world had been built on a foundation of perceived strength, and they were now forced to live in the shadow of a power so real and so vast that it made their own foundations feel like sand. click the like button if you believe understanding these moments is key to understanding our world today. The culmination of this psychological unraveling was not a single dramatic event, but a moment of quiet, devastating clarity. A new project had been announced in the camp, the construction of a large, concrete-lined drainage culvert to prevent erosion from the region's torrential downpours. It was a massive undertaking, and the German prisoners were to provide the bulk of the manual labor. For the first few days, they toiled under the hot Alabama sun with picks and shovels, digging a deep trench in the stubborn red clay. The work was grueling, slow, and familiar. It was the kind of labor that had built empires for millennia. The men fell into a familiar rhythm of sweat and exhaustion, their minds numbed by the physical exertion. It was a small, temporary return to a world they understood, a world where progress was measured in inches and paid for with aching muscles. Then one morning it arrived. It came over the hill with a low, guttural roar that vibrated through the soles of their boots. It was a bulldozer, a Caterpillar D7, painted a brilliant, optimistic yellow. It was larger than any farm tractor they had ever seen, a hulking beast of steel and diesel power. A single American civilian, a man with a sunburned neck and a wad of chewing tobacco in his cheek, sat perched atop it, his hands resting casually on two large levers. The prisoners stopped their digging, leaning on their shovels, and watched as the machine rumbled to the edge of their painstakingly dug trench. The operator gave a slight nod to the American foreman, then lowered the massive steel blade at the front. With a surge of engine noise that drowned out all other sound, the bulldozer lurched forward. The blade bit into the red earth, and the world seemed to shift. In a single, effortless pass, the machine moved more earth than all 200 prisoners had moved in the entire previous day. It carved a smooth, perfect slope, pushing a small mountain of clay before it as if it were loose sand. It reversed, repositioned, and charged again and again. The German prisoners stood in absolute mesmerized silence. Their shovels and picks, which moments before had been tools of labor, now seemed like children's toys. The weeks of backbreaking work they had anticipated were being rendered obsolete before their very eyes, condensed into a single afternoon of mechanized, almost contemptuous power. The technician stared, his mouth slightly agape, at the hydraulic pistons, the intricate track system, the sheer brutal elegance of the design. The sergeant watched with the eyes of a man seeing the ghost of his own defeat. He had fought against tanks, but this, in its own way, was more terrifying. A tank was an instrument of war. This machine was an instrument of creation, and it was clear which one was more powerful. In that moment, the bulldozer ceased to be a mere piece of equipment. It became a symbol. It was the physical embodiment of the entire American system. It was loud, it was powerful, it was brutally efficient, and it was operated by an ordinary man who treated its immense capabilities as something completely unremarkable. It was the definitive, unanswerable argument against their entire ideology. Willpower, discipline, and racial purity meant nothing when confronted with a 10-ton steel blade powered by 100 horsepower of raw, American-made diesel energy. The war they finally understood had not been won on the battlefield. It had been won in the factories, on the farms, and in the engineering labs of a nation they had fatally underestimated. This was not defeat. This was irrelevance. Subscribe and join our community of history lovers who seek to understand the past on a deeper level. The aftermath of that moment was a profound and lasting silence. The prisoners finished their work on the culvert, but their spirit was broken. They went through the motions, their bodies present in Alabama, but their minds adrift in the wreckage of their former lives. The bulldozer had not just dug a ditch, it had excavated a truth they could no longer ignore. Their struggle, which they had seen as an epic world historical conflict, was, from the American perspective, a problem to be solved, and it was being solved with the same dispassionate, overwhelming force that one would use to move Earth. This realization stripped them of their agency, of their sense of importance. Even in defeat, they had clung to the idea that they were a worthy, formidable adversary. Now they were forced to confront the possibility that they were little more than a nuisance, a temporary obstacle in the path of a much larger and more powerful historical force. The remaining months of their captivity passed in a blur. They watched newsreels of the fall of Berlin, the death of their Führer, the unconditional surrender of the German High Command. The images of their ruined homeland, of starving civilians and cities turned to seas of rubble, were a final, brutal confirmation of what they had come to understand. While they had been living in a land of unimaginable plenty, their own families had been enduring a hell of deprivation and destruction. The contrast was too cruel to fully process. The letters they began to receive from home spoke not of ideological defiance, but of a desperate, primal struggle for survival, for a loaf of bread, for a handful of coal. The grand narrative of the Reich had collapsed into 1,000,000 individual stories of suffering. The ideological bedrock of their lives had been pulverized, leaving behind a fine dust of confusion, shame, and a strange, unarticulated resentment. Resentment not just at their captors, but at their own leaders, at the propaganda machine that had so thoroughly and catastrophically deceived them. They had been lied to, not just about their enemies, but about themselves. They had been told they were supermen, when in fact they were the citizens of a state that had bankrupted itself, morally and economically, in pursuit of a delusional fantasy. The believer, the young man who had once dreamed of dying for his Führer, now lay on his bunk at night, staring into the darkness, hollowed out by a silence where his faith used to be. He had nothing left to believe in, not even his own hatred. The fortress of their minds had fallen, not to a frontal assault, but to the slow, inexorable pressure of an undeniable and overwhelming reality. Don't miss our upcoming documentary on the cultural impact of post-war reconstruction. Subscribe to be the first to see it. The journey home, in late 1945, was the reverse of their arrival, a passage from a new world back to an old one that was now almost unrecognizable. As they crossed the Atlantic, they were no longer the defiant soldiers of a conquering army, but the ghosts of a dead regime. The return to a devastated Germany was the final, crushing blow. They saw with their own eyes the reality they had only glimpsed in newsreels. They walked through the skeletal remains of cities that had once been jewels of European culture. They saw the hunger, the despair, the complete collapse of the system they had fought to defend. The vibrant, productive, and confident America they had just left seemed like a dream, a fantastical world on another planet. The contrast between the humming, continent-spanning factory they had been imprisoned in and the silent, corpse-strewn ruin they now called home was the ultimate judgment on their cause. In the years that followed, the experience of being a prisoner of war in the United States became a defining, though often unspoken, part of their lives. For many, it was a secret, a source of complicated shame. How could they explain to their countrymen, who had endured years of bombing and starvation, that they had spent the end of the war in a place of relative comfort and astonishing abundance? How could they describe the psychological shock of the bulldozer, the freight trains, the prefabricated barracks, to people whose primary concern was finding their next meal? The experience isolated them, placing them in a strange, liminal space between two worlds. They were Germans who had seen firsthand the power that had destroyed their country, and that knowledge was a heavy burden to bear. The sergeant, now an old man, would sometimes gather his grandchildren and tell them stories. But he did not speak of the thunder of the panzers or the desperate courage of his men. He spoke of the endless fields of American corn, of the highway that was paved by a single machine, of the freight train that was over a mile long. His grandchildren would listen, their eyes wide, thinking they were fables, fantastic tales from a mythical land. The technician used the knowledge he had gained to become a successful engineer, helping to rebuild his shattered country. He implemented principles of standardization and efficiency that he had first observed in an Alabama prison camp, a bitter irony that he never acknowledged aloud. He helped build the Wirtschaftswunder, the German economic miracle, a new kind of power built not on conquest, but on the very industrial prowess he had once so grudgingly admired in his enemies. The believer lived out his life in quiet obscurity, a man broken by the truth, his youthful fanaticism replaced by a weary, impenetrable cynicism. He never spoke of the war or of America. The memory was a wound that never healed. For these men, the war did not end with the signing of a surrender document. It ended on a train rolling through the American heartland, in a field watching a harvest, or in a patch of red clay in Alabama. It ended with the slow, dawning, and irreversible realization that their ideology had been defeated not simply by armies, but by a reality so powerful, so productive, and so fundamentally different from their own that it had rendered their entire worldview, their entire reason for being, utterly and permanently obsolete. This has been a deep dive into a little-known aspect of World War II. If you found this story compelling, please like, subscribe, and share. Your support allows us to continue telling these important histories.